Welcome back to Talk the Walk. With me now is Beijing Bureau Chief for the Economist, Rennie. He's also the author of the Cha Guan column on China. Thank you very much, Mr. Rennie, for joining us again. I want to take a look at China's economy because China outpaces the West, we can say, in economic recovery. And since the pandemic began, the global economy has suffered unprecedented hardships. If we look at the European Union's economy in the second quarter of the year, it shrunk like 11.8%, while China recorded a 4.9% growth in its third quarter. It's not as strong as before, but it kind of almost back to the pre-coronavirus level recorded in the same period last year, making the only major economy in the world to emerge from the crisis relatively unscathed. Why do you think that's the case, and does it demonstrate that China's economy is somehow more resilient?
So there's some big things that China got right. There's some things that China is just lucky to have on its side, like its very, very large internal market and its sheer size, which insulates it somewhat from collapsing demand outside. There are some question marks about China's growth, which I think will be worrying policymakers here. So start with the things that China got right. Well, that whole really, extraordinarily ambitious campaign to eliminate the virus very early on and to get the country back to work paid off. So you saw China very carefully started with things like construction sites and factories that could be relatively closed off. And it basically got people back to work before the whole country was opened up. They were very keen to get the economy sort of started again. And they put money into those areas where they could prime the pump with government stimulus. And so you saw infrastructure, as so often, when China needs to boost the economy, policymakers start to build bridges and roads and fix electricity lines and the big ticket infrastructure items that they can control relatively fast. And you saw that in the second quarter numbers for 2020, which were healthier than the rest of the world, but they looked a bit imbalanced. If you looked at the growth in those second quarter numbers, it was very much from things like manufacturing production coming back, so factories restarting, and it was very much things like infrastructure and stimulus spending. There was not much consumer demand. There was not much domestic consumption driving things like those service sector jobs in restaurants, tourism, those things. And the third quarter numbers we've just had, they look a bit more balanced. There's more domestic consumption. And that's useful because if you look at the thing that China got lucky with, it's that it could replace a lot of external demand because it has a very large internal market. So China had that. The final thing to worry about, though, is that they are still, in many sectors, they're not immune from a global depression. And I think that's what some Western countries are clearly looking at. And that will hit demand. You can get those Chinese factories up and running again. But if foreign customers aren't there, they're not going to be running at full pace forever.
You mentioned the growth of domestic consumption in the third quarter, and I want to ask you about this because some analysts suggest that it could be the result of a revenge consumption because people have been cooped up for so long. Now the lockdown has been lifted, so people went out and make luxury, massive purchases that was not sustainable in the long term. Do you think that could contribute to the third quarter growth?
I mean, I'm not sure about that. I think, it makes a nice headline or an analysis note about revenge consumption. I think, a lot of people, they just wanted to, they hadn't had a summer holiday. And so they wanted to take their kids to, Shanghai Disneyland for Golden Week. So it saw good numbers. Is that revenge or is that just people wanting their lives back? I think where there is an interesting issue where you mentioned things like the luxury sector, which has done quite well comparatively. I think one of the things that must be worrying policymakers here is that China, which is already a very unequal society with big cities near the coast, with rich, affluent urbanites, who can afford all kinds of imported luxury goods, and then a huge number, hundreds of millions of people living on very, very low incomes in the small cities and the internal countryside. That gap has grown even wider because of COVID. And so that inequality gap is there and maybe isn't picked up in those notes about revenge consumption and people buying, their third Louis Vuitton handbag to celebrate the end of COVID.
Interesting. Now, China may emerge a winner from the pandemic, but it's definitely an unpopular winner, I would say. in the international stage, a survey found that most people believed that China was not transparent regarding its coronavirus pandemic response. And you said on the show in April that the U.S. has created a geopolitical vacuum by adhering to its America First policy. But what would it take for China to gain recognition of the West and to truly become a global leader, if even not overcoming a pandemic?
Well, in some ways, China is running a natural experiment in how not to do it. China could have. China, I think, is absolutely adamant that there was no cover-up, that China was completely transparent, that it's outrageous to accuse China of having dragged its feet in terms of reporting the existence of this virus to things like the World Health Organization. I'm afraid that all serious reporting says there was a cover-up, including people within the Chinese medical system who, are on the record. Some of them are now silenced because they've been told never to speak to the media again. They were on the record that they were trying to send data through China's own disease control systems, but it was being suppressed for crucial weeks. There were cases in late December, certainly by the turn of the year, late December, early January. There were people in the system who knew that something very frightening was going on, potentially human-to-human transmission. It took another 3 weeks for China to lock down Wuhan, and who knows how many cases could have been prevented if Wuhan had locked down or at least shared some of that data with the world. One of the things that's really striking here in Beijing is I spent a lot of time talking to foreign embassies here, foreign ambassadors. They have very bitter memories of those early months of the pandemic. A lot of them remember, for example, that when it became clear that something very bad was happening in Wuhan in early February, they started to shut down flights from China or from Wuhan into their own countries. What happened? The Chinese Foreign Ministry called in ambassadors, berated them, said, "You don't trust China. This is very insulting. We demand that you restart flights. We demand that you lift these travel controls on people coming out of China." And then 3 weeks later, when the rest of the world started seeing spikes in infection in places like Europe and America, China, in a kind of act of breathtaking hypocrisy, stopped complaining about travel bans and slapped its own travel ban on the entire of the rest of the world, which is infinitely stricter than the ones that it had been grumbling about a few weeks earlier. And people haven't forgotten that China played a kind of double game there and looked extremely selfish.
Right. You talk about China's behavior early on, all the cover-up, the allegations of cover-up, and lack of transparency that obviously drew a lot of concerns here. And when dealing with a global pandemic, the issues of global compliance always come up. And quite frankly, states act differently because there's a lack of central authority to regulating state behavior. And the traditional wisdom is we'll introduce in international norms about how good states act and actually get the states to cooperate. But in this case, in this pandemic, we see China doing not very totally transparent at the beginning, and the United States threatening to cut funding to the World Health Organization, which has been under heavy criticism of favoring and coddling China. Do you think the international norm is crumbling during this pandemic? And how can states overcome the thin line between science and politics and come together and cooperate?
Look, it's really worrying. And I think it's possible to kind of resist the false choice of saying China is, right that the WHO is, it's perfectly possible to resist the false choice between saying, America is right to pull out of the WHO and to say the WHO is a kind of creature of China, or the other choice, which is to say that, China is completely right and the WHO is correct to congratulate China. I think both are to blame. America, under the Trump administration, was wrong to pull out of the World Health Organization, and it's been very, very damaging to see America surrender that role of public health leadership that we saw only as recently as the Ebola outbreak during the Obama years, when American scientists and doctors went to Africa, brought together other countries, and kind of led a very effective response to Ebola under President Obama. It's heartbreaking to see President Trump abdicating that responsibility, not just pulling out of the WHO, but also pulling America out of international programs to try and work out how to distribute vaccines if we get effective vaccines, making it clear that his view is it's America alone. America will spend its own money to push its way to the front of the queue. So that is dangerous and heartbreaking. But the other half of that is that China has done tremendous damage to the credibility of the World Health Organization because there really is a strong perception that the WHO is led by, its leader, Mr. Tedros, who's, so unwilling to confront China, so unwilling to say that China in any way covered up the beginning of this. But I think it has had a real sharp loss of confidence. And think back to SARS. So many of your viewers in Hong Kong will remember the vital role that international bodies like the WHO played when China was covering up SARS on the mainland.
Exactly.
And you had the tremendous authority of people like Margaret Chan, the Hong Kong public health chief, who then obviously later became head of the WHO, challenging China to be more transparent and to stop covering up this very dangerous disease. And it's such a different story now. The WHO just doesn't have that authority or that self-confidence. So even if you should blame America for pulling out, I think you can also blame China for really damaging the WHO by bending it to China's will.
All right, Mr. Rennie, fascinating discussion to have with you. I wish we have more time to cover more, but unfortunately time is up. That's all the time we have this week. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next week right here on Talk the Walk. Stay tuned.